As many cities across America burned over the weekend, there was a notable omission from the list of curfews, mass arrests, arson, and police brutality: Baltimore. The Maryland city is no stranger to racial tensions, having experienced civil unrest after the 2015 death of Freddie Gray in police custody. But demonstrations for George Floyd over the past 4 days, without a curfew, have been largely peaceful. Monday's youth-led march drew thousands on the eve of Baltimore's consequential mayoral election.
They had the protest. I saw a lot of love, saw a lot of unity. At the same time, there was a lot of anger and frustration being voiced from the protesters.
Attending this protest today, I was beyond moved by the vulnerability and the power that people of color presented.
The young people who led the march on yesterday did a phenomenal job. I don't know how many thousands of people there were there, but that was I've never seen a protest in Baltimore so big.
I'm really feeling inspired after being surrounded by so many powerful and empowering men and women that all came together for one common goal.
That's the story that needs to be told about Baltimore. It's not just riots, it's young people standing up against injustice and demanding better.
On Tuesday, Republican Governor Larry Hogan tweeted, "I'm proud that Baltimore is showing the nation how we can begin to build a more perfect union." Thousands of young people and community leaders expressed their frustrations peacefully while working with police to stand up to a handful of extremists with a violent agenda. "This is how real positive change happens," he wrote.
In Baltimore yesterday, we were a national example of what it looks like to engage in passionate protesting without widespread breaking of the law.
Even as protests grew tense late Monday night after an agitator set off fireworks at officers and Maryland State Police activated reinforcements, both police and protesters avoided violent escalation. Activist Kwame Rose helped disperse crowds and turn over an agitator who was setting off fireworks to authorities.
Go home. We proved our point. We did what we came here to do tonight. Do not turn this into something it does not have to be.
I wanted to keep the protesters in their rage safe and not controlled but orchestrated in a manner that was strategic, so that today, when we wake up on the next day, we get closer to fighting for our goal.
This is not to say there hasn't been unlawful behavior, but the roughly 20 arrests over 4 days of protests pale in comparison to those in other major U.S. cities, dozens of which have been under curfew.
I went through this in 2015 during the riots in Baltimore. One of my primary focuses was to try to lower the temperature.
The Gray protests led to the Department of Justice in Baltimore agreeing on a consent decree to implement reforms in the city's police department, including de-escalation training and enhanced transparency.
Millions of dollars pumped into the city after the Baltimore uprising, but the community where Freddie Gray grew up still looks the same.
We still have a lot of work to do. Absolutely not. Incidents have happened in Baltimore City since then. And so, no, it just proves, again, that we have a lot of ground to cover.
Yes, we are upset. We are angry. But that destruction, in a physical sense, is not going to work here. But we've seen the result of destruction. We've seen how they come after us. And so we did not need, we want to show the catalyst of, we've learned from mistakes of the past.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.